Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today's extra episode is a conversation between me and Robert Saunders as part of our pivotal UK election series about the election of 1997, the last great Labour landslide. We're going to be talking about how Tony Blair achieved his amazing triumph, what it meant for Britain, what it meant for the Labour Party, and also how it connects to what might be going to happen tomorrow. Last time we talked about an election that I had some childhood memories of. You, understandably, being 8 months old, didn't. Today we're talking about an election that I think most adults who live through it have fairly strong memories of, even people who aren't that interested in politics. The 1997 election was very memorable. One might almost say notoriously memorable. It was a very memorable night. There were some famous results. People still talk about where they were and what they were doing when they saw Michael Portillo lose his seat. It delivered an absolutely thumping Labour landslide. I was trying to reconstruct from my own memory whether that landslide was a surprise. So I seem to remember that there was still quite a lot of uncertainty right up to election day as to what the result would be. I don't think there was much doubt that Labour were going to win and probably win a majority. But it was a period where the party was scarred by the elections of 1992 particularly, but also 1987, where the polls had been pretty misleading. Polling was not particularly accurate in this period. There were thought to be these people called shy Tories, and certainly in 92, the polls had misled the Labour Party. And exit polling is a lot better than it used to be. Exit polling was quite bad then. In 1987, Neil Kinnock was sort of grabbed by, I think Vincent Hanna was the reporter, and told that he might be forming a minority government on the basis of the exit poll. He was about to be absolutely crushed. So the party was scarred. My memory of it was there was still quite a lot of uncertainty right up to the election as to whether the polls, the popularity of Tony Blair, the obvious unpopularity of the Conservative government, would it actually translate in the ballot box? Do you remember it that way?
I don't remember it that way, but I think that is because I was a first-year student at the time, and I was in a very Labour city as well. So in that sense, locally, it felt like the direction was clear. But I think nationally, that's absolutely right. So firstly, as you say, the polls had a terrible result in 1992. They had got that result very badly wrong. And although they'd actually done a lot of work to correct that by 1997, it meant there was a real suspicion of the polls, and they played a much smaller part of that campaign than they have done this year, for example. But also, I think, looking back, it can seem like 1997 was inevitable. Of course, there was going to be a Labour landslide after 18 years of Conservative government. So we have to remember that 5 years earlier, Labour had lost its fourth general election in a row against a leader that most Labour politicians didn't particularly rate, and at the tail end of a recession. This was a party that had only won 2 serious majorities in the whole of its existence. Only 2 men had ever led the Labour Party to an election win, and that was Clement Attlee and Harold Wilson. And Labour had been very conscious throughout the 80s and 90s that its traditional electorate, unionised voters working in traditional heavy industries, that electorate was shrinking. So I think it's not at all surprising that Labour insiders were really not hanging out the bunting and not preparing the victory speeches in 1997 because they had those scars on their back.
As you say, in 1992, the Tories won on the tail end of a recession. And I think one of the things that gave people pause in 1997 was that the economy was doing pretty well. And actually, there had been 3 or 4 years under John Major, under the chancellorship of Kenneth Clarke, in which it could be painted as an economic success story. The great unknown was, did the electorate still have, not just in the back of their minds, but the front of their minds, Black Wednesday? So we now know with hindsight that Black Wednesday, the event in September 1992, when Britain was forced out of the exchange rate mechanism and interest rates were raised and raised and raised over the course of a couple of days, and then a humiliating exit had to be engineered. We now know with hindsight that that did trash the Tories' reputation for economic competence. But at the time, it wasn't clear. There were 2 things that could be told about that Tory government. One of which was something had happened 4 years ago, more than 4 years ago, which had looked really bad at the time, a kind of economic disaster, but actually had really good consequences. And here they were 4.5 years later. And actually, since then, the economy had done really well and they had managed it pretty well. And I don't think until that election, it was known which of those two would dominate in the minds of the electorate. 4.5 years is a long time. We now know, and I still think it's quite surprising that this should just be a brute political fact, that what happened on Black Wednesday did for the Conservative Party, not just for that parliament, but for a long time to come. It took a long time to recover from what effectively had trashed the brand.
Yes, and of course, it's only a few years at that point since one of Bill Clinton's advisors had famously said, "It's the economy, stupid." So it was supposed to be one of the rules of the 1990s that elections are fought and won on the management of the economy. So given, as you say, that inflation was below 3% year on year, interest rates were around 5 to 6%, which was the lowest since the 1960s, Britain was starting what would turn out to be 16 years of consecutive growth. We might imagine that the Tories would have done much better in this election. And I think there is probably several reasons why it didn't. One is that voters have to feel economically better. The economy is an abstraction which doesn't necessarily connect to how people feel about their individual lives. And a lot of voters have taken a lot of economic pain. The recession of the early 90s hadn't been as deep as the recession of the early 1980s, but it had been almost laser targeted on Tory voters. So a party that took real pride in extending home ownership had presided over colossal increases in mortgage rates. White-collar workers had been hit particularly hard in the early 90s recession. And unemployment was still above 8% until I think about 1996. So there was still quite a sense of economic precarity among exactly the kind of voters that the Tories needed if they were going to win that election. I think there was also a sense that this had happened insofar as the economy had recovered after Black Wednesday. That had happened despite the Tories rather than because of them. It's very difficult as a party to claim credit for a spectacular economic humiliation and the collapse of your economic policy. But thirdly, if you really want as a party to benefit politically from the economy, there has to be a sense that your opponents are a danger to it, that whatever it is that you've done, that your opponents might put that at risk. And for all the sorts of reasons we might come on to, New Labour have been absolutely precision-focused on removing any sense that it was an economic threat, removing any sense that it was going to embark on some kind of dangerous economic project. So for all those reasons, the Conservatives don't really get the kind of bounce we might expect. Although it's perhaps just worth adding that it is possible that the Conservatives did get some benefits from that economic recovery. When we compare them, for example, to the Conservative Party in Canada in 1993, which suffered an almost complete wipeout, and I think was left with 2 seats. And that had been a fate that Conservative strategists were aware of and were mesmerised by in the mid-90s. So it is possible that it did, if you like, raise their floor.
There are clearly parallels with now. The Conservative Party has been through another trashing the brand event, which was Liz Truss's premiership, but specifically the collapse of her flagship mini-budget economic programme in the face of the market. So something similar happened. And that whiff of panic, a few days in which there's a run on the pound and there's a feeling that a government has lost control of the absolute basics of its economic strategy. In the case of John Major's administration, it cost him his Chancellor, Norman Lamont. Liz Truss, it cost her premiership. The difference now is that it's relatively recent. It's not that long ago. It's actually, I think today, the second brand trashing event. The first was Partygate, which, if you look at the polling, in 1992, the Tories, just before Black Wednesday, were polling above 50%. So however accurate or inaccurate polls are, for a sitting government, especially one that's been in power for that long, to be above 50% is remarkable. And after Black Wednesday, it collapsed by 20 plus points and never recovered. The current Conservative Party, Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, were relatively neck and neck. Partygate knocked 10 points off Conservative polling. Liz Truss's premiership locked another 15 off. So there are 2 things here. There's no coming back from that. But also, the economy is not booming, as it was in 1997. So we'll talk about 1997 in more detail in a second, but that parallel with the Canadians in 1993, it has been raised as a spectre in 2024. I don't think the Tories are going to end up with 2 seats, but As you say, 1997 weirdly could have been worse for the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party survived to fight another day, and as it does, it reinvented itself and it came back to power. This time could be different.
Well, if we go back to Black Wednesday, we know it's a big moment in politics when a label loses its scare quotes. So politicians spend a lot of time trying to label things. They talk about the dementia tax or the death tax or Partygate, and they usually have little rabbit ears around them. Whereas with things like the Winter of Discontent or Black Wednesday, they're just used as if they're neutral labels. And that tells you something about the power of a moment. And Black Wednesday was an absolute cataclysm for the Conservative Party. We don't need to trouble ourselves particularly, I think, with exactly what happened on Black Wednesday, because most electors didn't really know that either. But what they did see, played out live on television, was the complete collapse of a government's economic strategy. They saw a government that was spending hundreds of millions of pounds of reserves, trying unsuccessfully to prop up the currency, that raised interest rates to 12% and then to 15%, and then in front of the world had to beat a humiliating retreat and devalue its currency. And for a party that has spent years saying, we are the party of home ownership, they're now raising mortgage rates, that we are the party that makes Britain walk tall again in the world after years of decline. Its chancellor is now a laughingstock on television. Or the party that says only we can be trusted with safe economic management, that now appears to have sort of driven the economy off a cliff edge. It's very difficult to shake that. And as you say, the Conservatives had won this extraordinary victory in 1992. They were well ahead of Labour still in the polls, and within weeks they were, I think, 11 points behind Labour, and they never recovered again.
You could say the two phrases that have lost their scare quotes in recent times are Partygate. People talk about Partygate, it's entered the language. And the other phrase is Liz Truss. Liz Truss is used, just her name is used to signify and symbolise something that doesn't brook any argument. Everybody knows what you're talking about. That's part of the Conservative Party's problem now. That's happened really quickly. Winter of Discontent, Black Wednesday, Partygate, Liz Truss, they belong, I think, in the same category. And it's a rare category. You don't come back from that.
And we might add another one from the early 90s, which is sleaze. That all sorts of allegations, which in themselves might not have been particularly important, but cumulatively build into a sense that this is a party of entitlement. This is a party that's been in power too long. Whether it's sort of rather tawdry stories about ministers sucking the toes of attractive young ladies, or whether it's about cash for questions, or the Matrix Churchill scandal, all of this builds up. And it runs through the election campaign itself in 1997. Those who lived through that election might remember Neil Hamilton, who was under a cloud because of allegations about cash for questions, the Conservative MP for Tatton. The BBC journalist Martin Bell challenged him as a sort of anti-corruption purity campaigner. The other parties stood down their candidates. And so you had made for television this encounter between the man in the white suit representing purity and Neil Hamilton, who became a kind of avatar in the public imagination of Tory sleaze.
New Labour was built from the scars of the previous election defeats. As you said when we were talking about 1979, this is when Tony Blair becomes conscious of politics. This is his political awakening. He doesn't stand for Parliament in 1979, but he's going to be an MP by 1983. And his generation, Blair, Brown, lived through this series of defeats. Some of them, like in 1983, are foregone conclusions, but they get progressively more disheartening as they happen under circumstances that look more and more propitious. And of course, 1992 is the preeminent example of that. 1992 looked like an election that the Labour Party somehow contrived to lose. And the result of that is New Labour. New Labour is part of a series of reforms of the party. It's not something that just happens after 1992. Peter Mandelson has already been working some of his magic, if you think of his magic before that. But nonetheless, the rebranding is really, it's ruthless after 1992. And the party changes in really significant ways. One of the ways I think it changes is the manifesto. So I've been reading the manifestos before we've been having these conversations. It's very interesting. I do recommend to people. They're not as boring as you might think. Some of them, to be honest, some of them are a little dull. But they're surprising in various ways. And the Labour manifesto in 1997 was very much a New Labour product. And what really stood out to me reading it now is how little statement of principle there is in that manifesto compared to the Tory manifesto of 79, which really is very strong on the principles, the things that the party stands for, what it believes in. The 1997 Labour manifesto is full of practical proposals of things that will be done. It's full of policies that have immediate practical payoffs and very little about what we stand for and what we believe in and who we are. And in a way, every manifesto since then has been more like New Labour's manifesto in 97 than the Tory manifesto of 79. It's a very, very different document from the manifesto of 1945.
That's interesting. I think I would read it slightly differently, actually. I think it's a really interesting document, the 97 manifesto. And part of the problem, of course, is that if we read it now, we can go online and we can download a text file, but that isn't what people at the time encountered. What they got was a glossy, beautifully produced, very colourful, very dynamic-looking booklet. And that right from the start actually sends a message. This isn't the shambolic party of Michael Foot, the sort of amateurism of previous Labour leaderships. This is professional, this is glitzy, this is kind of business-friendly. And it's got that great heading, Labour New Life for Britain. That's a really ambitious declaration. It then begins, our case is simple. Britain can and must be better. The vision is one of national renewal, a country with drive, purpose and energy. The objectives are radical. The means will be modern. It talks about the coming millennium, opening up a new era for the country. So it's really tonally projecting a sense of change, a sense of a new frontier. And I think it does then go on to make quite an interesting argument, which is that we stand on the frontier of a new world in which the internet, globalization, the rise perhaps of new economies in other parts of the world is going to transform the world. And so while we can hold to the values of the past, we have to break with the methods and the instruments of the past. And it lays out a kind of third way doctrine, that we will neither take the old Labour approach, which is very statist, very controlling, very bounded by the nation state, nor will we take the Thatcherite conservative approach, which is just to chuck people in the sea and hope that they swim, but we're going to have the intelligent state, which uses its sort of coordinating and convening power to skill the public, to find new ways of navigating this world. And what I think it does really successfully, because of course most people never read the whole of a manifesto, is that it identifies policies that sort of illustrate that approach. And actually my favourite example of this isn't from the manifesto, but it's from Tony Blair's speech to the Labour Party conference in 1995 as leader of the opposition. And he's talking about the rise of the internet. And no one knew what the internet was in 1995, but it was clear it was going to be very exciting. And he suddenly announces that as leader of the opposition, he has made a deal with British Telecom that they will connect every school in the country to the internet. And it's a magical act of theatre, because firstly, it conveys the impression that he's already governing the country, that this is a guy who can get things done. But secondly, it just illustrates that New Labour creed, that we're not going to nationalise the internet, we're not just going to leave it to the market. What we're going to do is use the power of the state to partner with industry to make sure that the next generation of school leavers have the skills they need for this new technological world. And Blair was magnificently talented at identifying those little policy proposals.
I suppose what I mean by saying compared to the Thatcher manifesto, it doesn't seem to have these grand statements of principle. It certainly has grand statements of aspiration. It is an extremely aspirational document. But it is very much show, don't tell. I mean, it almost feels like the people who wrote it had been to creative writing courses at university where the lesson one is show, don't tell. And it has that feel to it. There is a lot of laying out what they will do in practical terms. Margaret Thatcher was a tell. I don't know if she was a tell, don't show, but she was a tell politician. She told people what she thought, but she also liked to draw dividing lines. She was a politician who liked to say, there's us and there's them. The Labour Party under Tony Blair, its aspiration, in his words, was to be the political wing of the British people as a whole, which had a weird echo of the IRA and Sinn Féin, but still that was the aspiration. The dividing lines weren't there. So there was this grand millennial vision. This is the future. There's a dividing line between the past and the future. That's clearly there, and they are the party of the future. But as a document to address the electorate, it was to try to include everyone in a series of proposals where, there's something for everyone in there. And reading the Labour Party's manifesto for 2024, it still really has that feel to it. It's different. We'll talk about Corbyn's manifesto in 2019, but the current manifesto does feel a lot like the manifesto of 97.
Well, in a previous episode, we talked about the 1945 election, and tonally, at least, in some ways, I think the 97 manifesto has some similarities with the 45 manifesto, not in terms of the scale of its policy proposals, but in terms of its vision. Because in 1945, it was all about Labour as a national party. We talked about how the word socialism only appears about 3 times, whereas nation or national appears 56 times. The Attlee message was, and this was in posters as well, that this isn't just the party of the working class. It's the party of everyone who contributes to the country. It's the party of the pensioner, of the young mother, of the scientist, the technician, the manager, the organiser, all of these people coming together, whereas the Conservatives are the party of a privileged class. They are the party of an elite. And that's a language, actually, that we find in Gladstone's rhetoric back in the 19th century. And that's very much what Blair is trying to do in this document. He's saying, we are the party of the British people. And then there's this little sort of encampment, which is the Conservative Party, which is there to reward its friends, is a sort of self-interested, selfish, elitist party. And that's the kind of division I think he's trying to draw.
One of the big differences between 97 and 79, as we talked about, in 79, Margaret Thatcher manages to do well across the whole of the UK, leaving out Northern Ireland. She does well in Scotland, she does well in Wales. In 1997, the Conservative Party are reduced to a party of England. So they are wiped out in Scotland. They are wiped out in Wales. Labour becomes the party of the Union in that sense. Labour does incredibly well in Scotland. It becomes the dominant party. In Scotland, until the SNP overtake it 2 decades later, it does extremely well in Wales. Labour is the party of the whole country. And the Tories are on the path, which they may well still be on, of being the party of English nationalism. And this is quite a dramatic and sudden shift. But 97 does mark that shift, and we've not really shifted back from that.
So in some ways, I think it's surprising how little the Conservative Party goes down that route after 1997. I think it's a very Anglo-centric British party, but I think it's in some ways quite reluctant to take up English nationalism. And there are lots of reasons for that, some of them personal. William Hague has been Welsh Secretary. He's learning Welsh. He's married to a Welsh woman. There are still some quite significant Scottish senior Conservative politicians. They may have lost their seats, but they're still kind of around the party and the leadership. But it's also because the Conservatives may have been an English party after 1997, but they're not the English party. Labour wins nearly twice as many seats in England as the Conservative Party do. They win a larger share of the vote than the Conservatives do in England, which is extremely unusual until 2005, when the Conservatives narrowly overtake them. So the nature of the union is that England provides 80% of all seats in Parliament. So you cannot form a government unless you have substantial representation in England. You cannot have a government that is not attentive to English concerns, that is not thinking constantly about what English voters want to do, and that isn't largely staffed by English men and women on the front benches. And Tony Blair himself, of course, although he goes to school in Scotland, projects as a very English personality. So in that sense, it's always quite hard for an opposition party to find the room to be an English nationalist party, because you can't be a party of government unless you're very attuned to England.
Do you think the Labour Party was misled by its success in Scotland in 97? It looks like it has become the natural party of government in Scotland. Many, outside of Blair, many of its leading figures are Scottish. Gordon Brown, Robin Cook, Donald Dewar and others. You do then get Scottish devolution. The thing that was promised in 79 but never happened does now happen under the first term of Tony Blair's Labour government. And there seems to be an assumption, maybe a slightly complacent assumption, that this will work fine for a Labour Party in Westminster, because the Labour Party in Westminster will be naturally allied with the Labour Party in Scotland, which will be the dominant party in Scotland too. It takes a while, but when that unravels, it really unravels spectacularly, because the Labour Party in Westminster becomes the party against which the SNP makes its pitch. And the Labour Party in Scotland, within a generation, it's going to change in this election, but within a generation, is going to be wiped out. Do you think 97 was slightly misleading for Labour? It felt like it was the party that had finally brought all of the bits of the union together, thereby making devolution possible, because it would still be politically stable. Because what's the glue that will hold a devolved country together? The glue is the Labour Party. Well, no, that turned out not to be the case.
Possibly, but I think parties can only really deal with the world that's in front of them. And I think it's very difficult in 1997 to envisage what's going to happen 18 years later in 2015. And I think what New Labour might say in their defence is that in 2010, when New Labour loses power in the United Kingdom as a whole, its share of the vote in Scotland actually goes up. So New Labour could claim that their electoral record in Scotland remains very strong right until the moment that they're expelled in other parts of the Union.
As you said, one of the reasons the Conservatives can't become, and there may be many reasons, can't become the party of English nationalism is they are not the only party of England. The Labour Party are more successful than they are. But this is also an election in which other parties are standing, which are making a case for a different kind of, and I think you could call it English nationalism. So the UK Independence Party, UKIP, does stand in this election. It is an absolutely tiny party, and it gets almost no votes. It gets a few more votes than Arthur Scargill's True Socialists, or whatever they were called. UKIP is a complete irrelevance in this election. It's led by a man called Alan Sked. I don't think anyone pays them the blindest bit of attention. The party that does get attention in this election is the Referendum Party, now probably long forgotten, but led by James Goldsmith, Sir James Goldsmith, campaigning on a single issue, which was a referendum on Europe, standing in not every constituency, but more than 500 constituencies. And many people have a memory of that election night, which often turns on the moment when Michael Portillo lost. My enduring memory of the 1997 election was the defeat of David Mellor in Putney, which was the seat that James Goldsmith stood in. He didn't do well at all. I think he got 2,000 votes. Labour won, and Labour were going to win in Putney whether James Goldsmith stood or not. But the count was a memorable moment because Goldsmith stood there shouting at Mellor, "Raus, raus, raus, out, out, out." It was a glimpse of a completely different kind of politics that somehow on this night of happy, clappy Labour euphoria burst in. There was something else going on here. It was only a little glimpse of it. But in 97, the glimpse was there. The Referendum Party were a harbinger of something.
Yes, it's, I think, the biggest ever attempt by a new party to smash into the electoral system. If we think back to 1906, where we began this series, the Labour Party, I think, only runs 50 candidates in that election. The Referendum Party in 1997, as you say, runs well over 500. It's funded by a multi-millionaire at a time when the regulation of national rather than constituency spending at elections is much more limited than it is today, which means they can run these candidates. They can also do things like sending millions of video cassettes through the post around the country to ordinary voters, putting their message. Now, in the end, they only win about 2.6% of the vote. But the point was never to get Referendum Party MPs in Parliament. The point was to terrify the Conservative Party into ideally backing a referendum, but if not that, then adopting a more Eurosceptic policy. And in that, it is entirely successful. The Telegraph did an analysis in 1997 of, I think, 385 Tory election manifestos, and it found that, I think, well over half of them opposed a single currency. Only 3 of them, one of whom was Ted Heath, said nice things about the European Union, and they all had a markedly Eurosceptic tone. And that produced one of the most remarkable features of the campaign, which was that in the middle of an election, John Major had to issue an appeal to his own candidates to stop this. And he said famously, "Don't bind my hands when I am negotiating on behalf of the British people." Now, I think you're right to say that there's a sort of flicker of something futuristic about this, because ultimately, I think the technology wasn't there for a disruptor party like the Referendum Party. If you're having to send video cassettes through the post, you've got a problem. But 20 years later, you just put those videos on Facebook. You can spend quite small amounts of money and reach enormous numbers of people. So the possibilities for a party like that would grow exponentially.
The Labour Party had been a pretty Eurosceptic party in the 80s. It had been a Eurosceptic party under Michael Foot, and it had gone through a great conversion, thanks in part to a famous address by Jacques Delors at the Labour Party conference, persuaded that the European Union project was actually a vehicle of, among other things, workers' rights and better conditions for workers. In 97, would it be fair to describe the Labour Party under Tony Blair as clearly having staked out a pro-European prospectus? So this vision of the future, we're going to leave the past behind, we're going to embrace something that is, by this point, being called a globalized world or globalization. It has clearly very strong connections with Bill Clinton and his administration in the United States. But was it also quite clearly marking out Europe as the future, not the past?
Yeah, so firstly, of course, New Labour is just much more disciplined than the Conservatives in 1997. And that's largely the discipline born of 4 consecutive election defeats and 18 years out of power. It's remarkable when you look back at that campaign just how quiet people like Tony Benn or Diane Abbott are. There's very little heard from them throughout the campaign. But it's also true that the party had really turned itself around on Europe. It had come to see Europe not so much as a market, which had been very much how it saw it in the 70s, as a kind of vehicle of international capitalism, but increasingly as a way in which countries could work together to do the sorts of things Labour wants to do in terms of regulating working hours, providing employment protections, the sorts of things it had failed to do in all of those years of Conservative government. And for Tony Blair, again, there's something sort of symbolic about it, that this is a new kind of organisation, that we're moving away from a past based on small nation states that can't actually regulate the global forces of the economy. So as a modernising party, we're now going to carry that into international organisations and work together, both to unleash the benefits of globalisation, as Blair always saw them, and to tame its potential dangers.
And Blair himself was seen at the time as a very popular politician. It was recognised that he had an appeal that his predecessor, John Smith, probably lacked. We don't know. So one of the what-ifs of British politics is, had John Smith lived, the Conservative Party looked like it was doomed anyway. You might have got a similar result, probably not on this scale, but a similar resounding Labour victory. And who knows what a John Smith administration would have been like. But Tony Blair had a charisma and a popular appeal that went way beyond John Smith, went way beyond Neil Kinnock. Neil Kinnock was Welsh, John Smith was Scottish, Tony Blair, so he sometimes liked to say he was Scottish, was English, and he projected a certain kind of Middle England. The Tories wanted to label him as an Islington politician, but he projected a kind of Englishness. Yet all the evidence is he himself had profound doubts in the run-up to that election. I mean, some of it was clearly just superstition as to whether they were going to win. He was genuinely scarred. And one of the things that he is said to have considered very seriously before the election is if the result was close, if he emerged with a precarious majority, and if the Liberal Democrats did quite well, and it looked like they might well do quite well, they were reinventing themselves under Paddy Ashdown, this was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reconfigure the electoral system, to introduce some or other form of proportional representation, to cement the anti-Tory majority. The thing that was clear is that this election would produce a majority of the electorate not voting Conservative. I mean, almost every election has produced that, but this would be on a greater scale. And I think there is quite a lot of evidence that he was pretty serious about that project. And then it was blown out of the water by the scale of his victory. And we talked about this a bit last time, that changing the voting system is so hard because the politicians that have the political capital to do it are the ones who've just won a thumping victory under the system that's to be changed. The ones that might have an incentive to change it, say it had been a much weaker Labour government, would find it much harder to change the system. Is there any sense that 97 was an opportunity, because they're very rare in British politics, to change the way that politics is done? Was it an opportunity?
Yes, I mean, as you say, when you talk about Blair's popularity as a leader, it is extraordinary that his approval ratings in 1995 were about 66%. This is sort of approaching post-Soviet dictator levels of support. Private Eye famously said that he was the only member of the Labour Party a normal person could ever imagine voting for. He did have an appeal to sections of the electorate that weren't historically drawn to the Labour Party. But yes, he was very anxious about that election. And although he would become increasingly sceptical about proportional representation, I think there were lots of things that were tugging him towards some kind of deal with the Lib Dems if the election result had gone differently. One was that he had become very close to Roy Jenkins, who we talked about in the previous episode, former Labour grandee, founder of the SDP, who had encouraged in him the idea that the great tragedy of the 20th century politically was the split in the Progressive Alliance before the First World War, that you could have had a century in which Labour and the Liberals worked together to shape the 20th century. Instead, those two parties had fought one another and allowed the Conservatives to dominate instead. So the idea that you could heal this historic divide, that you could bring back together again the progressive forces of British politics, was one to which Blair was very drawn. He was also, of course, always drawn to the idea of modernisation. He wasn't at all respectful of Britain's ancient constitution. In all sorts of ways, he liked the idea of making Britain a more kind of European-style political entity in which you have things like, human rights law, you have devolved power, you have a Supreme Court that sits outside your legislature, and it's not hard to see how electoral reform sits in that. But I think that project really collapses the moment the exit poll comes in, because it's very difficult to say to your party after it's won a colossal victory that the first thing we'd like you to do is to abolish yourselves, to make sure that half of you lose your seats at the next election, and that even on the kind of poll share that they've won in 1997, we're never going to form a majority government again. So it is precisely that structural lock that we talked about in the last episode. You can't change the electoral system unless you can win power under first past the post. And if you can win power under first past the post, it is going to bring you riches that you are very unlikely to give away lightly.
His popularity reached its peak in the autumn of 1997 after the death of Diana, when I think it touched 90%. I mean, that was when it reached kind of Kim Jong-un levels. Unlike John Major, who 6 months after his victory in 92 was done by an event, Tony Blair cemented himself in the popular mind as a new kind of politician. The most successful speech he ever gave was his People's Princess address after the death of Diana. And he really was riding high at that point. And he had a kind of reach that no politician in my lifetime, I think, has ever matched. It does also raise the question of what would have happened if what had been expected to happen after the death of John Smith for a short while until it realised it wasn't going to fly, which is Gordon Brown became leader of the Labour Party. So Blair and Brown were thought to be very similar politicians in their outlook and their approach to what the Labour Party needed to do. But temperamentally, as we were to discover, they are very, very different. They had different psychologies. They had different backgrounds. Brown expected that he would become leader, and in the end he had to swallow that he wouldn't. Blair, it became a foregone conclusion. There was a point at which Blair just became the coming man. But had Gordon Brown been leader in 97, would this have been a different government? I sometimes think what would have happened, so these two between them were going to divvy up the next decade and a bit. But you could have had Gordon Brown in terms 1 and 2, and then Tony Blair, the charismatic politician, coming in to inject some glamour into the project in its dying days, instead of which you had the glamorous person up front with more popularity than he knew what to do with, more political capital than anyone could spend, succeeded by the doer pragmatist at the end, and that wasn't going to fly. Is there another version of this where you get a different kind of history of that decade?
Well, there's a great Doctor Who episode in there, I think, because it is very difficult to say what a Brown premiership would have looked like if it had happened earlier, because I think it's clear that losing the leadership to Tony Blair had quite a profound psychological effect on Gordon Brown, and that he wasn't the same person by the end of 2 terms of Blair government that he had been in the mid-90s. But it's very difficult to imagine New Labour in retrospect without the charisma and the glamour of Tony Blair. Tony Blair was someone who was very good at embodying his times. I remember Polly Toynbee once said that she thought he was the only Prime Minister of her lifetime who seemed to actually like the country and the time in which he was living. And I think that was exactly right, actually, that this was someone who, before things went wrong with Iraq and the war on terror, someone who was playing head tennis with Kevin Keegan, who was a very keen footballer, who was praised at the Brit Awards by members of Oasis and other big bands, who really seemed to kind of capture and express the zeitgeist in a way that's very difficult to imagine Gordon Brown being able to do. Now, that might not be a bad thing. There might be some advantages to a politics that isn't quite so plugged into the sort of celebrity culture of its period, but it was a huge part of Blair's political arsenal.
We talked about the inheritance of some earlier Labour politicians. So when Ramsay MacDonald became leader in 1923, it was not a propitious time to become Prime Minister of a minority Labour government. My God, the world was a mess. My God, the country was a mess. My God, there was a lot that needed sorting out. As you said, when Jim Callaghan became leader in 1976, I mean, that was a toxic inheritance, and he did a pretty good job of just holding things together. There has been no prime minister in modern British history who has had a more gilded inheritance than Tony Blair. He inherited a stable, booming, soon to be booming economy, going through this remarkable period of steady growth, allowing Gordon Brown to claim hubristically that boom and bust had been abolished to the dustbin of history. He inherited a secure majority in the Commons and a Conservative Party that had been reduced to a kind of infighting, not quite a rump, but not much of a threat. He had enormous personal popularity. The world was at peace. This was 1997. This was the best time to be in charge of a major power. And yet, before the election, he was scared he might not win it. The campaign was very cautious. It was very risk averse. He locked himself in for that first term to a whole series of commitments, and he believed it was absolutely crucial for Labour to lay the ghosts of the past, that it did what it said it would do in that first term. But he did have an extraordinary inheritance. So it's tempting with hindsight to think that he didn't make as much use of it as he could. There was a mismatch between the remarkable range of things that he inherited and the pinched, nervous and cautious approach that he and his party took to winning that election. So it's probably too harsh to say with hindsight it was a mistake, but it feels a little bit like a mistake. And part of the reason I'm asking this is because we're living through another such period now where the Labour Party knows it's going to win. It's not by any means a gilded inheritance that Keir Starmer's going to get. It's anything but a gilded inheritance. There is no money. There was a lot of money in 1997, and Tony Blair spent it. He spent it on the NHS and so on. But this was not as ambitious a programme as some in his party would have liked. And greater ambition was at least possible.
I think if we want to understand New Labour, that combination of optimism and fear is really important. On the one hand, how could this man not be cautious? He had come into Parliament in 1983. And I think it's an under-recognised point about Tony Blair when people suggest he was a careerist or a closet Tory or whatever. He chose to come into the Labour Party at the absolute nadir of its modern history. And he then spent his career stumbling from one political disaster to another until the mid-90s. And that is enormously, powerfully politically formative. So I don't think it's surprising that he was nervous about his party's prospects in 97. But there was also this sense of new challenges opening up and a new world becoming possible. A world in which the Cold War had ended. A world in which the internet was about to revolutionize daily life. In which the scale of global trade or of global financial transactions across the world was escalating to a pitch no one had ever seen before. So there is, in Blair's rhetoric, quite a sort of New Jerusalem idea that we stand on the mountain looking down into a country that we don't yet understand, but we can build something. And I think it's fair to ask whether Labour used the majority it was given as extensively as it could have done. But I do actually think that this is a more radical government than it's given credit for. And I think in some respects, in retrospect, we're becoming more conscious of that. It's quite interesting how many Conservative politicians now claim that we live in a sort of Blairite consensus. This is a government that transforms Britain's constitutional arrangements. It creates new assemblies and parliaments for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that creates the Supreme Court, that passes the Human Rights Act, that expels the hereditaries from the House of Lords. It oversees very big social changes, the Equalities Act, things like gay adoption, repealing Section 28. It's also, of course, a government that, for good or ill, does very big things in foreign policy, in terms of the war in Afghanistan and then particularly the war in Iraq. It doubles the NHS budget. It introduces new social programmes like Sure Start. It creates a dedicated Department of International Development. It makes the Bank of England operationally independent. Now, maybe that doesn't stack up against the record of, say, the Attlee government, but it's quite a profound transformation. And there is, I think, a bit of a pattern in Labour history that governments are seen as disappointments when they end, and then there is a long wilderness period in which the alternative becomes rather more visible. And that makes possible perhaps a rethinking of what that government actually achieved.
One of the accidents of history of the New Labour period is if there was a view that the first term was for consolidation, and the election of 2001 produced almost as big a landslide, which is a remarkable achievement and probably could only have been achieved by a steady as you go first term. And then the second term might well be the point at which it is possible to go further and faster. But by that point, two things had happened. First, the relationship between Blair and Brown, I think, had already more or less broken down. Blair had considered sacking Gordon Brown at various points, and he was encouraged by some to do that. And he saw Gordon Brown as the block to some of his more radical ambitions, some of his more radical reforming ambitions. And at the same time that he was coming to the conclusion that Gordon Brown was the barrier in the way of some of the change he wanted, 9/11 happened. And 9/11 did change him, because there was a part of Tony Blair that always wanted to see the biggest possible picture. He was a connect-the-dots politician. That's how he thought. So he thought that the goal in politics is to connect the widest range of dots so that you can embrace the biggest possible picture. And 9/11, and this is in his own memoirs, triggered in him a sense that there was an even broader vision that was now opening up to him of a kind of connectedness at the global level that required his attention. And at that point, his premiership went down a different track. He did not sack Gordon Brown. I'm not saying if he had sacked Gordon Brown, good things might have happened. The party might have split. But there was a future where Blair thinks, right, the second term is for doing some of the things we didn't do in the first term. Gordon Brown is in the way. But 9/11 takes him down a different path. And in the end, that becomes the path that defines his premiership.
It's one of the reasons why I'm skeptical of a sort of manifesto fetishism, is that governments are almost always dominated by things that are not foreseen at the time when a country goes to the polls. Nobody in 2019 was talking about a global pandemic and the shutdown of the economy, nor were many people envisaging a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Likewise, no one in 2005 is talking about the great financial crisis. In 2015, perhaps less excusably, there is very little sense that that parliament will be dominated by Brexit. So in that respect, 9/11 sits in quite a long tradition of governments being blown off course by extraordinary events that happen outside them. But I think you're right that this isn't just a sort of external shock to which the government has to react. It is something that changes Tony Blair himself as someone who had quite a visionary approach to foreign policy, who wanted it to be about kind of grand ideas, the remaking of the world, the spread of democracy. And before 9/11, that's very much funneled into things like international aid, debt forgiveness, a certain number of smaller military operations, but also one centered on international organizations like the United Nations and to an extent the EU. But 9/11 really transforms that. And I think it's one of the what-ifs of history. If in the same way, if Ramsay MacDonald had died in 1924, his reputation would be entirely different. If Tony Blair had handed over the reins in 2001, we would talk about his premiership in radically different terms.
As you describe it, it does make that period from 97 to 2001, the first New Labour term, really unusual, because that one wasn't blown off course. No, unless I'm forgetting the event. It's a bit like Clinton's administration in the United States. There is something odd about the 1990s. Of course, lots and lots of things happened. There's no period where history just stops. And history certainly hadn't ended, though people were talking at that time about the end of history. But 97 to 2001 was not a period in which some great event intervened. And some great event intervening is the norm, not the exception. So 97 to 2001 is the exception, not the norm, which means it was a very rare opportunity. And I do think some of that time was squandered. My most depressing moment in political terms of the first Blair term was on, I can tell you the day, the 4th of January 2000, when I went to the Millennium Dome to see what they'd put in it. And it's hard to describe just how shit the Millennium Dome was, what was in it, the vision that it embodied, the waste of money. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was quite a lot. The incompetence of it. So what? But it felt like this was a government that was doing things it didn't need to do, and yet it had had an absolutely unique opportunity, maybe, to do something bigger. So it's easy as a non-politician to complain that politicians don't take advantage of the opportunities that they're given. But the Millennium Dome for me did capture something about New Labour, which was there was a tendency to be sidetracked. And I think from 97 to 2001, with hindsight, one could say that on some things that government was sidetracked. They couldn't know how rare an opportunity that was, but there is no real 4-year period like it.
I have to say, I rather enjoyed the Millennium Dome, but that might be because I went there on a date, so I was probably sort of feeling loved up.
I feel we need to have a conversation about this. Which bit did you like? It was full of tat.
I remember there was an illustration of how the human brain worked, which was based on a particularly fine Manchester United goal. So I do remember enjoying that bit.
That's very New Labour.
But I suppose if the Millennium Dome is perhaps Exhibit A in the case against New Labour using its opportunities, we'd have to balance against that something like the extraordinary achievement of the peace process in Northern Ireland. And one advantage of not being blown off course by a major shock or not battling a failing economy is that Tony Blair was able to spend, I think at one point, about a fifth of his time on negotiations in Northern Ireland. And again, in retrospect, that can look like something that was kind of predetermined by history, but there were serious political risks in play here. There were moments at which it appeared like it was going to go badly wrong. It could have been the defining feature of that government, as in a way it had been of previous governments at the time of the Sunningdale Agreement and so on, that this was another failure, that it was a sort of hubristic prime minister who had reached too far and had once again failed. So I think we would have to give New Labour some credit for using some of that scope and time available to it actually to do something remarkable in relation to Northern Ireland.
It did play right into his skill set as well. It's hard to think of another politician who had that range of gifts. Tony Blair did have extraordinary attention to detail. He wasn't at all a kind of David Cameron essay crisis prime minister, if that's true of David Cameron. He really was laser focused when he needed to be. He had great charm and he had real ambition. He thought he could do things that other politicians couldn't. I completely agree. I think what happened in Northern Ireland in 97 is a remarkable tribute to his unique political skills. I want to ask you a last question because where possible, we want to connect these episodes to what's going on now. We're getting nearer to July the 4th. We're still a way out. We don't know what's going to happen. Do you have any sense that history might be repeating itself in one way, which is this is a Labour Party about to come into power again after a series of increasingly shattering defeats? And the most recent, which is the one we're going to talk about next time, probably the most shattering of all, 2019. The defeats got worse in a way. 2015 was pretty shattering too, actually. 2017 was a brief blip of sort of weird fantasy optimism. That this is a party so scarred by defeat that it's very cautious, very professionally run campaign, safety first, don't frighten the horses, don't take anything for granted, risks boxing it in a little bit in the way that New Labour was boxed in 97, or is this the price that you pay? This is the price you pay under a political system like ours. This is the requirement for getting back into power, and then you do what you can with what you've got. But to say at this point, as some newspaper commentators have started saying, look, Sir Keir Starmer, you're going to win, so you can stop all that other stuff and actually start talking to us straight about what you want to do and also the constraints on what you might do. That's asking of any politician, that's asking for the moon. You're not going to get 2 weeks out from an election a politician saying, I now know I'm going to win, so here's the real story.
I think there is a significant tonal difference actually with 1997, that we've got the caution without the optimism. That I think we do have to keep those two things in tandem with New Labour, that there was the caution on policy, but we're not in this election getting the promise of new life for Britain. And actually, I don't think the political mood is there to accept that kind of slogan. We're not opening the manifesto and reading about a new era opening up for Britain. And there perhaps isn't quite the same, whatever we may think of it, quite the same sort of coherent third way ideology. The sense that we have a vision for the state that stands between two poles that you recognise politically. I think there's a reasonable case to be made, actually, that Starmer's Labour is more radical on economic policy than it's given credit for, and more radical on economic policy than the Blair government was. But that's partly because it's operating in a context of deep concern about Britain's economic future in a way that New Labour wasn't in 1997. New Labour could think more about spending the proceeds of growth, whereas Starmer's offer has to be much more about trying to engineer growth in the first place. So Blair and Starmer are living in radically different worlds. And I think they're putting forward radically different visions of Britain's future.
3 things are happening tomorrow, and you can decide which you think is the most important. There is a general election happening in the United Kingdom. We are putting out our episode on the previous general election, the one in 2019 that saw Boris Johnson defeat Jeremy Corbyn and by some complicated, circuitous route led us to where we are today. The other thing that's happening is my new book is out. It's called The History of Ideas, and it is based on an earlier version of this podcast. It is a book about the great thinkers and the great ideas that have shaped modern politics, from Rousseau to de Beauvoir, from Rosa Luxemburg to John Rawls. If you like this podcast, I really hope you might like my new book. The History of Ideas, it's available now in all good bookstores and wherever you get your books. And one more thing to add, we are going to be doing an episode in our regular slot on Sunday about what we assume is the pivotal election of 2024. Robert and I will be catching up when the results are known and doing some instant history too. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.